Okay. Public health. All right. Let's start with a story. And that's this guy, Alvin York, a kid from Fentress County, Tennessee. His dad owned 50 acres of poor land up in the hills, and he had to feed a large family as a teenager by hunting in what were the common hunting grounds. And he said that his dad threatened to muss me up right quick, muss me up right sharp if I failed to bring a squirrel down with the first shot or hit a turkey in the body instead of taking its head off. And so York had to shoot for his food, for his family, for his large family. And he became very good at turkey shoots. He shot best when he was drunk, and he started to get drunk around age 12 or so. He killed 6 turkeys with 6 shots in one turkey shoot. He later became a deacon in the Church of Christ. Right, because that would get metal in the meat, and so he wanted to shoot him in the head so that all of the turkey would be edible. If you shot him in the chest, you'd have to pull out the bits, and you'd lose some of that meat. So he later became a deacon in the Church of Christ, and like many Southerners, did not want to fight in World War I. We often think, or there's a kind of impression that we get that white Southerners are much more inclined to fight, to become soldiers and things like that. But this was not really true in World War I. The Lost Cause did not send many people wanting to fight in the U.S. Army, as you can imagine. He, for his reasons, though, had nothing to do with being from the South. It had everything to do with the Bible. And he had been troubled by many Bible verses that he had read that suggested that he should not fight. Blessed are the peacemakers, right? And so he decides that he's not going to fight. And then someone shows him Ezekiel 33, which says, when God brings the sword on the land, that'll set up the man for their watchman. If the watchman doesn't respond to the call to fight for his people, then the blood is on his head. If people don't respond, then God will require his blood. And so this eventually is the thing that persuades Alvin York to become Private York. Now, what's going on here? Why the Bible? Why reading the Bible? Now, reading the Bible is something that goes obviously all the way back thousands of years, but reading the Bible literally is something that's new in the progressive period in the American South. And it starts in the 1870s and 1880s, and reading the Bible as a literal document to tell you what to do is something called fundamentalism. And I want to talk a little bit about where fundamentalism is and where it comes from. To start with, remember I talked about what would Jesus do in that book, In His Steps. There was something called the social gospel, in which many, mostly Northern Christians, believed that child labor, monopoly, and liquor were all bad, and they tended to support reform movements to fix those things, right? And so you had lots of Christians who were involved in reform movements who targeted these issues. This didn't appeal that much in the South, as you can imagine, because Northern reform had also been behind the abolition of slavery, and so there's a kind of the idea of a social gospel, the idea that Jesus was a communist, which is what some social gospelers said, that Jesus would have hated rich people and things like that, doesn't appeal all that much in the South. There's a response, though, to the social gospel, and a response to some other changes that's associated with these folks, Dwight Moody and Ira Sankey. And they create what's called fundamentalism. And fundamentalism starts actually in Britain in the 1840s with a very small group, but Moody becomes an evangelist in 1873, and in a series of, he dies in 1901, probably converts 1 million people to Christianity in the time of his life, which is kind of astonishing. He said the Bible was very simple. John 3:16, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, so that whosoever shall believeth in him shall have everlasting life. And so he said, all you have to do is believe and you're saved, right? That's what John 3:16 says. So there's this emphasis on a literal interpretation of the Bible. He would tell these kind of Bible stories. There would be a very rapid conversion that would take place, and you would become a Christian. Music was a crucial part of this, and this is why Moody and Sankey were together. Sankey was a musician, a kind of a composer, And they created the Moody and Sankey songs, which are all numbered and which people learned by heart. So what is this about? So this is how they convert people. They convert people in this kind of mass meetings. They say he has something called the wordless Bible. He says it's white on the top, red in the middle, and black on the top, red in the middle, and white on the bottom. Black is the state of your soul before you know Jesus Christ. Red is the blood that he shed for you, and white is the state of your soul after you realize that. That's all you need to know. That's the wordless Bible, according to Moody. Okay, so Moody is a fundamentalist. A series of books come out after he dies called The Fundamentals, which are about Moody's religion. And it's actually a very complicated religion, fundamentalism. It's premillennial dispensationalist, okay? So that means most of us who are not raised in the fundamentalist tradition, who are raised in a traditional Baptist or Methodist tradition, believe that there was a 1,000-year reign of the church that began with John and the Roman Catholic Church and then moves forward. Premillennials believe that that didn't happen yet, that the 1,000-year reign of the church has not yet begun. Okay, so that means the church is actually, in most cases, Catholic Church, but also Protestant churches, that's not God's word. God's word is only in the Bible. And so they believe that the 1,000-year reign has not begun, and they also believe that reform is pointless. Reform is not a good idea, that you should only save individual sinners, and that's where the Salvation Army comes from. Salvation Army is you're going to save one sinner at a time. You're not going to try to reform them. You're not going to try to change the way the state works. None of those sinful ways are the way to change things. So what is fundamentalism? Fundamentalism is opposed to the idea that you can reform people to Christianity. It's basically a belief that there should be no reform, or in fact, things should get worse and worse before they get better and better, and we shouldn't rely on sinful man. Does that make sense? So many of you may not have been raised in the fundamentalist church, but there are all sorts of ways of dividing the Bible. Crucial to this, though, is a literal interpretation of the Bible. Every word is literally true in the Bible. So we should really understand the Word of God. None of it is metaphor. None of it is a kind of, the old Bible was the covenants of faith, of work and redemption, right? And so there's a covenant of faith, the covenant of works, the covenant of redemption are the traditional ways in which the Bible was divided up. The fundamentalists divided up in this other kind of way, which is basically arguing that line by line, everything is true, but you just have to be able to understand and interpret it. Okay, becomes stronger and stronger in the South among blacks and whites, and Sergeant Alvin York, is a fundamentalist. So it attacks spiritualism, the idea that one's connection to God can be through nature. It attacks Darwinism and the idea that the world is older than a few thousand years. No, the world is not older than a few thousand years. It is, in fact, just 5,000 years old or so. In a large part, this fundamentalism is a response to the do-gooder Christianity. It's a direct opposition to the old social gospel, and it's popularized through music. It was hugely popular in this period, right? If your grandparents, probably your great-great-grandparents, people who are alive in this period, there very likely would have been at one point in one of these fundamentalist churches. They were popularized through regiments, through music. American regiments that ran into each other in World War I, a person would shout out, "Sing 521," and everyone, most of the people in the regiment would know Song 521 from the Moody and Sankey Bible and sing it. Okay, so this is the world that York is in. He needs to find a line in the Bible that tells him that he should fight, and he finds one in Ezekiel 33. He arrives at Camp Gordon in Georgia in the end of 1917, and by 1918, he's in the Argonne Forest. The Argonne Forest is the final offensive of World War I. It's the most lethal battle for Americans in history until Normandy in 1944. There are over 26,000 people killed in this one battle, 26,000 Americans who are killed in this one battle. And so while the U.S. casualties in the World War I as a whole are relatively small, The casualties in this one battle are tremendous. The Argonne Forest is in northeastern France. Massive line advances against a line of heavily entrenched German machine guns. And thousands of lives are lost when the Germans advanced near York because they got too far ahead of their lines and then got stuck there. So they're surrounded effectively. And so York's company, he's a corporal, his company is surrounded and there's no way he can get out. He and about a dozen men are stuck well inside of enemy lines and they're pinned down by machine gun fire. And so what he does to protect his men is to find a place to stand next to a tree, and he gobbles like a turkey. And as soon as a German soldier would put his head up, he would shoot him in the head. All right. So he was an incredibly good shot, and he took down a whole bunch of people in this machine gun nest. He lost some of his soldiers. But he killed a large number of folks. A group of 6 people then rush him, right? 6 German soldiers rush him. And he's got no bullets left. He pulls out his pistol, no bullets in his rifle left. He pulls out his pistol and he shoots the person in the back of the group first, knowing that the person in the back would get the most shots at him. And then he kills every other person that comes to meet him. And at that point, the company commander, surrenders to him, thinking that he has a whole regiment behind him. It's really just those 12 soldiers, and he's now down to 7. Okay, so that's Sergeant York. He won the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Cross de Guerre, and he became the famous Sergeant York. Something like 200 soldiers, German soldiers, surrendered to him and 6 men who had persuaded the Germans that they represent a much larger company. Okay, this is the story of an individual. It's heavily promoted in the United States, made into a film, and it captures, I think, some of what's interesting about the rural South in this period. But the war is actually very different than that. It's a great story, but it doesn't actually tell us that much about the war itself. It wasn't an assembly line, but there were lots of technologies that were new in World War I, like machine guns. There had been Gatling guns, but these machine guns are much easier to load. And you have artillery, you have tanks. All of these things require more knowledge, right? So they're not just deadly, but they also require a lot of work. And if you're in a tank or operating artillery or even operating a machine gun, it's actually fairly technical. There's a technical manual for each of these things. You have to spend a lot of time learning them. And SAT skills that we talked about before that were important in factories, what we would call SAT skills, had always been a problem in the South because of poorer schools. And it became most apparent in World War I when the U.S. starts to institute what are called intelligence quotient tests or Stanford-Binet tests, what we call IQ tests. IQ tests started in France in around 1906, but they come to the U.S. really during the armies, during World War I. And they become a way, you're supposed to, like in this image on the right here, you're supposed to fill in the thing that's missing. You're supposed to be able to quickly write an X in the third circle. There's a whole bunch of other things that are done here. And and so these IQ tests become ways of deciding whether you go into which service you go into, right? Do you operate a machine gun? If so, you need an IQ of 120 or above. Are you military police? Yes, you're military police if your IQ is 80 or below. And so this IQ test is used. It's distributed to every soldier. They're called the alpha and the beta tests. And it greatly popularizes the test. And what the Army discovers is that Sergeant York is a fluke. And recruiters discover that rural men in the South are much, much worse than urban men. They have lower strength, they have more serious physical debilities, and they have lower intelligence. This is troubling and disturbing for many people in the South, that these IQ tests, they question whether these IQ tests are correct or not. And it begins a kind of progressive era campaign to figure out what's wrong with the South. And over a period of years, they figure out what it is. First of all, One of the more important ones is pellagra. Pellagra is something that hadn't hit Southerners before the war, but did start to hit Southerners, mostly white Southerners, after the war. And they're called pellagrans, people who have this skin condition and these other, it basically, pellagra is a kind of horrible disease in which you develop these sores, your body kind of melts. There had also been malaria and yellow fever in southern cities, and they had figured out how to deal with the mosquitoes to stop those. But there were these new things that were less well understood. Pellagra is one of them, and it comes basically from eating corn. As Southerners are eating lots of corn, but they're not eating the kind of trio of corn that people in Native Americans had eaten, which was corn and rice and squash. Or sorry, corn and squash and beans, and they weren't getting most. In Mexico, when rice was eaten in the ancient period, people used it with lemon, which pulled out the vitamin B3 with the niacin in the corn. But if you eat corn and you don't get any of this lemon or lime juice, then the niacin is not absorbed in your body. The nicotinic acid is not absorbed in your body. And so an absence of nicotinic acid is widespread in the South, and it's a serious problem. The other is rickets here. And rickets is a deficiency of vitamin D. So but it was also a big problem in the South. Sorry, you can't see that. So researchers found in 1915 that it results from the lack of nicotinic acid or niacin, and a flood in Mississippi in 1927 causes an outbreak of pellagra, and a researcher, Joseph Goldberger, who had been sent by the Rockefeller Foundation to figure out what was broken about the South. He then says, you need to feed all these people with baker's yeast, and because baker's yeast has nicotinic acid in it. And it turns out that that's what saves lots and lots of people from pellagra after the 1927 flood. And so this is a serious problem. In the American South, people who are eating corn, many of them had pellagra, particularly poor people, also rickets. Finally, hookworm as well. Hookworm is roughly 40% of Southerners in 1915 had hookworm. That's the estimate. Sorry, in 1919. 40% of, and so that's a nematode worm that enters your body from human feces. There's the hookworm in there, and through the foot. And it creates worms in the intestines, which eat the food in the body and produce anemia. And so this, again, is a Southern thing, in part because you have to wear shoes in Minnesota, right? Almost all the time. But lots of Southerners don't wear shoes. And in doing so, they kind of, if you step in human poop, there's a very good chance that there is a pretty good chance that you're going to get hookworm from somebody else who already has hookworm. So progressivism in the South is all about the outhouse. The outhouse becomes a big thing. The most important progressive reform in the American South, arguably, is the outhouse, which is demonstrated in country fairs in 19 teens and 20s to prevent farm families from relieving themselves in barns or in backyards so that the sort of poop doesn't get retransmitted. Right, that's the poop. So that's just FYI. There are lots of valuable life lessons. Right? There's lots of valuable life lessons in this class, and one of them is don't step in human poop, because in fact the hookworm can burrow. It needs just a little bit of space to burrow through the skin. So progressivism, Alvin York, so one part of progressivism then is the public health emergency, really, that becomes visible with the IQ test in the South. The serious problems in the South, which turn out to be basically public health problems that are these three things: pellagra, hookworm, and rickets. And all of them, so one of them is transmitted, the hookworm, and the other two are basically vitamin deficiencies. And it's really in this period that we start to see fortified food. So if you eat white bread now, it's fortified with niacin. It's fortified with these trace amounts of these minerals so that you don't get this. And so as a result, poor people don't have pellagra anymore. They don't have hookworm. They don't have rickets, because even the cheapest food is mandated that it have a little bit of these things in it. And so that's progressivism, and that's something that does change the South pretty dramatically in terms of public health. And who's responsible for that? Well, partly it's the IQ test for kind of showing it up, and then partly it's the Rockefeller Foundation, which heavily, that's John D. Rockefeller's investment in the South to try to figure out what's wrong with the South. It's investing in millions of dollars in trying to discover this. They don't actually know what, they know that there's pellagra. Pellagra is understood all the way back to, I think, to the 18th century, but they don't know what causes it. And so the Rockefeller Foundation is the people who figure out what causes it. Hookworm also, yeah, it's not that people didn't know about them, they just didn't know how they're transmitted. Didn't really fully understand them. Rickets was better understood. That was actually one of the few, because remember, I don't know if you've heard the term limey to describe British people. That's because British sailors would be given lime, would be given lime or lemon on the ship, and that was to prevent them from getting rickets. So people knew that you needed vitamin D, and then knew that that was the, oh wait, that's vitamin C. Anyway, people understood sort of that rickets was a vitamin deficiency, but it wasn't that well understood. Okay, so that's one part of progressivism. Another part of progressivism is the Black Women's Club movement, which starts, and so there are female reformers like Jane Addams and others, white reformers in the 1880s and 1890s, and this is at a time when women are not allowed to work in many occupations. A Black Women's Club movement emerges in 1896 and becomes very popular in the 1900s. There are more Black women than white, as a percentage of population, the Black Women's Club movement is much more vital and much larger than the White Women's Club movement, almost twice as large. And so this is a movement among sort of middle-class African Americans, women, some in the North and some in the South, that emphasize things like reform. This is including schooling for children, but also anti-lynching and other sort of progressive era reforms. And so this starts to change Atlanta and Richmond and a lot of other southern cities. Birmingham become very large, and the National Association of Colored Women is formed in 1896, and it's got 50,000 members in the United States by 1910 or so. And so this is another, so there is a reform movement that's led in part by African American women, and this is it's important. It's almost necessary because the sort of lynching movement that's happening in the South, Black men are seen as threatening or dangerous. Prohibition was also an issue, and they tended to be very supportive of prohibition and saw it as a scourge for African Americans. So now the war was opposed, I said, in the South. It was especially opposed in the mountains, World War I. People didn't believe in fighting this. And once prohibition starts in this period, the mountains change. So this is a race car, and race cars are popular, and as soon as there are cars, there are races in cars. But around the time of Prohibition, mountains become the place where one produces moonshine. And so in the area near Dahlonega, I forget, Danielsville in Georgia, becomes a big place for producing moonshine. And the moonshine is delivered from Danielsville down to Atlanta, which is a fairly long distance. And you had to avoid people who are revenuers, people who are connecting the internal revenue on this liquor, or basically, before they had been trying to collect a tax on this liquor. After Prohibition, they're trying to prevent the liquor from coming into Atlanta. And so it's around this period in the sort of immediately after the war that a bunch of distillers become excellent race car drivers because they have to race through county lines to get liquor. which is in the backs of these Ford cars and Ford trucks to Atlanta, and then hightail it back to Danielsville the next day. And this is where stock car racing emerges in the South in the 1930s. Is a bunch of moonshiners sort of get together and take stock Ford cars, soup them up in various ways, and see which of them will run faster or more quickly. And so stock car racing is a weird response to progressivism in the South. Another thing about the progressive movement that doesn't actually make a whole lot of sense, but the Southern response to progressivism, weirdly, is the stock car racing. All right. Now, another feature of progressivism, and this is going to surprise you, I think, is the Klan. Because the Klan is also a progressive movement in some ways. It's clubs. It's devoted to. So there was the Ku Klux Klan. It existed from 1868 to 1872. It basically dies out in 1872. It reemerges in Stone Mountain, Georgia. It's very easy to become a member this time. In the Second Klan, you just send away for a membership card. $1 extra gets you a hood. Becomes very popular for former Southern whites who had moved to the Midwest, Southwest, and Far West by the 1920s. But lots of old Yankees also become members of this organization. It's mostly anti-Semitic and anti-Catholic in this period. It's also anti-Black, but a lot of what it ends up doing, the stuff that it ends up doing in the West and the North is opposed to Jews and Catholics. It's committed to closing off free immigration, which happens in the 1920s in the U.S. They get legislation in 1921 that limits European immigration, emergency legislation, and this becomes quotas for European immigration. And these quotas are basically racial quotas. They say immigrants from the North and West are perfectly acceptable. Immigrants from the North and West of Europe are acceptable. Immigrants from the South and East are not acceptable. But it was also a rural movement aimed at attacking the evils of the city, and it helped to kind of nationalize white Southern identity. It grows up after The Birth of a Nation movie was released in 1915, along with many racist novels by Thomas Dixon, like The Leopard Spots, which basically glorifies the old Klan and gets people to join this new Klan. It was popular in Athens. They gathered at the old Confederate monument that was on Broad Street. The Klan dies out late in the 20s when the founder is caught after drugging, kidnapping, and then raping his secretary on a train, which tends to undermine the whole clean Anglo-Saxon protector of womanhood image. The Klan is a progressive movement because it says it's going to clean up politics. It says it's going to catch slackers in World War I, but it's disliked in many urban areas. But there are some urban areas like Muncie, Indiana, for example, where it's very powerful. Okay, so just very briefly to talk about Menken. Menken is one of the people who kind of becomes very popular in writing for New York audiences about the backwardness of the South, about the problems of the South, making fun of the South. He's from Baltimore, and so he sort of sees himself as he is a sort of Southerner, and so he attacks them. The key issue that emerges in this period, bear with me here for a second, is the Scopes Monkey Trial of 1925, which pits two kinds of progressivism against each other. One kind of progressivism is the progressivism of Cross of Gold. I don't have my lecture here in front of me. William Jennings Bryan. So in the Scopes Monkey Trial in Tennessee, certainly the public health change in the South is much more has much more effect on the South, much more positive effect on the South over the long term than does Reconstruction. Well, yes, I mean the end of the slavery is obviously the most positive thing to happen to the South in a certain sense. But Reconstruction doesn't quite work in the way that people expect, and there are lots of reforms that are ultimately overturned. In the public health benefits of progressivism are very visible, just sort of in the heights of Southerners, white Southerners, IQ tests for white Southerners, all these other sorts of things for white Southerners, and black Southerners as well, drastically improve as a result of the progressive movement. So in the Scopes monkey trial, you have a biology professor who teaches evolution, biology teacher who teaches evolution to his students. Fundamentalists in Tennessee create a board, and the school board says that you cannot teach evolution in the school. Scopes ignores them, and he's brought to trial in Tennessee. And it pits two progressives against one another. One of them is William Jennings Bryan, who had been the previous presidential candidate in the Cross of Gold speech, 1896. He's from the northern Midwest, but he is a fundamentalist. He believes that every word of the Bible is true. He's a progressive, but he believes that that Darwinism is a failure, is wrong, and he said, "I'd rather know about the Rock of Ages than the ages of rocks," and he defends is for the prosecution in Scopes's trial. The defense is Clarence Darrow from Chicago, also a progressive, also had been an important political figure in Chicago, and he said he believed in Darwin. He said he was a Christian, but he wasn't sure if God existed or not. He did believe in the Bible, but wasn't prepared to believe every word of it, and believed that you could comport the Bible with Darwin's thought. That Darwin's ideas had revolutionized all of these fields: biology, anthropology, archaeology. Their sort of understanding of the world had greatly improved because of Darwin. So it's obviously true. It seems to be obviously true that Darwin's story is correct. And so, we just have to deal with it. This monkey trial is one in which the white Southern resistance and white Southern fundamentalism, which is much more popular in the South, kind of comes under trial. And it's after 1925 that we see fundamentalism as a movement kind of decline. Effectively, Darrow refuses to argue the case on the technicalities. There are all sorts of problems with the way in which the case was prosecuted. He wants to make it just on one issue, the separation of church and state. The state cannot intervene and demand certain religious traditions be enforced in the schooling. Because of this, the court basically finds that Scopes is guilty. It goes to the state Supreme Court just a few weeks later, and the state Supreme Court immediately overturns it based on the many problems with the way in which Scopes was tried, the way in which he was informed, and the way in which he was told not to teach this anymore. And it sort of, in some sense, quietly goes away, and the fundamentalist movement does decline somewhat. It doesn't disappear, of course, and there are still a very large number of white Southerners and black Southerners who are fundamentalist Christians. But fundamentalism is maybe perhaps one of the places where this the most kind of decidedly anti-progressivist movement, like a movement that is directly opposed to some of the principles of progressivism, is important. That said, of course, William Jennings Bryan is a defender of this movement. So what is progressivism? I can't, honestly, I have no idea. Honestly, I think progressivism as a term doesn't help us a whole lot. There are many of these radical changes that take place, but sort of drawing a circle around it is really impossible. Let me conclude by talking about the South. Some things about the South that we see that are distinctive in Alvin York's story is the sort of emphasis on guns, hunting, and home defense is going to become a way in which Southerners are going to define themselves increasingly white Southerners are going to define themselves increasingly from the 1920s forward. The self-conscious divide between the city mostly in the north, and the countryside, mostly in the south, is going to continue. And it's one that doesn't go away. It's one that continues very largely. We see this, of course, in the United States. It wasn't true in the 1970s and 1980s, but increasingly we've gone back to a kind of progressive era where the cities are pitted against rural areas by and large in much of the United States. This was helped by rapid industrialization in northern cities, and the fact that the northern cities was a place where many immigrants came to. But that's what it is. What is Southern progressivism? It's public health, which greatly improved the South. The bizarre result of World War I IQ tests and the Rockefeller's investment in the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller, no, not Ford Foundation. It is the Ford and the Rockefeller Foundation's investment in trying to discover what was wrong with the South and why IQ tests were so low in the South. It's the Black Club women's movement, the anti-lynching campaigns, but also anti-alcohol campaigns, moral reform, pushing for high schools, and in this period, the mandatory high schooling. Previously, if you went through 6 grades basically got to age 12, you no longer had to go to school. Increasingly in the progressive era, the expectation is that you need to go to school for longer. There's a shift in Southern religion away from towards a literal interpretation of the Bible, and not exactly, not really. You could argue that's a. this is why I can't make sense of Southern progressivism, but there is a sense. It's a kind of anti-science bent in the kind of fundamental religion. There is a lot of opposition to sort of Northerners sticking their noses into Southern affairs and things like that. In retrospect, it's absolutely vital that we eliminate Pellagra and these other problems in the South. But there was a real sense that Southerners had been were being mistreated and being considered low down and considered useless. Yeah, I don't know. It's this is up to you guys ultimately. This is a big exam question: is what is progressivism? What part of progressivism is interesting or most important? I think we see an opposition to city habits in Rome and things like that. That would sort of line up the fundamentalist movement with progressivism. That's one thing that fundamentalists did believe in. Reforming was alcohol. The disappearance of another thing that's connected with this period is a disappearance of black and white Southerners to the north, a real brain drain from the 1880s all the way up until the 19-teens. The Klan reappears, broadening anti-black violence to also anti-immigrant violence. A growing awareness of the physical debilities of staple agriculture and poverty, and that comes about with the reform of food. It's the Food and Drug Administration that's initially supposed to protect you from bad food, initially supposed to, identify if milk is bad or those sorts of things, to put a seal of approval. Increasingly is about making sure that people get all the vitamins that they need as micronutrients inside white bread and other things that were widely consumed. So Southern progressivism is all these things. Southern progressivism is a mess. I don't know if the fundamentalist movement is anti-progressive or pro-progressive. I just know that the South is, in some ways, much better off by these results. And I apologize